Hey, so I'm going to abridge a personal philosophy of mine before we get going with this video, as it's going to come across as pretty overt racism. My personal belief is that people shouldn't attribute the successes, accomplishments, and failures of single people within a racial group to the rest of the racial group. So I am going to dissect an argument. It's a YouTube video that I found online with a young black female discussing gentrification. I think the title's something like On Gentrification.
This video is going to be about gentrification.
No, actually, I already watched this. It's hardcore racism.
Brooklyn is really the hub of gentrification. People are calling it the face of gentrification. And also now, Detroit. What inspired me to make this video was an article that I saw on the New York Times website, which of course you guys know I will link, that is basically about how white people especially, but artists are leaving Brooklyn and are moving to Detroit. I always felt like Detroit was abandoned because it is a majority black city. They basically said, nothing but niggas live here anyway. We don't really give a fuck about the city. We don't give a fuck, bitch. We don't give a fuck about you or anything that you do.
Detroit was not abandoned due to race. Detroit was abandoned due to a severe amount of layoffs and job cuts due to automation. That had nothing to do with race whatsoever. A lot of jobs in automotive manufacturing were outsourced to China. And the fact of the matter is nobody in the US gives a shit about the Chinese. But you know what? We're consuming their products and they're employed because they're cheaper, they're more effective, and they're producing it. If you're a producer and you have a commodity that's in demand and you're manufacturing it, nobody cares if you're Chinese, black, white, Asian, Latino. If you have what's in demand, you will be employed. The reason people left Detroit has nothing to do with the fact that a majority of Detroit is black. And the people who left Detroit were also a majority of the black people who lived in Detroit.
I read a really good article recently about how, black-owned businesses are quietly bringing Detroit's economy back to life, but nobody is talking about it because we just all love some disaster porn, right? We love seeing Detroit looking like a fucking bomb went off. We don't see that they have, a bustling downtown area with lots of small businesses.
No one actually gets off on destitute Detroit. Nobody cares that Detroit's in ruins. I would suspect that 98% of the US population couldn't even identify the Detroit skyline. Nobody cares about Detroit, no matter how burned out and destitute and trashy it is. You know why? Because there's Haiti, there's poor African villages, and you could see vultures circling overhead. There's people much more destitute, which is thoroughly more entertaining to the sick people watching these images. That's why the Haitian with the vulture circling behind him won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm not saying this because I'm a sick sociopath. It won the Pulitzer Prize because people are fascinated with horrific images. And you know what? Detroit's not that horrific. It's just a shitty looking city. Nobody gets off on it.
Now, something interesting has started to happen as Detroit's economy has kind of hummed back to life, and that's that you have these white people that are starting to take notice, especially artists and people that, they feel like, they're vibrant, creative people. They need to live in a vibrant, creative area, and they find that places like Brooklyn, Fort Greene and stuff like that are becoming too sanitized and gentrified. They're looking at Detroit as, the wild, wild west, the unexplored, frontier,
Artists don't exist as a consumer culture. They're not a demographic within the consumers. Artists don't exist. Such a minuscule amount of artists actually make money doing art that they're not a part of the demographic. You mean young trust funders, people with wealthy parents predominantly who you're suggesting are white, which is probably true, young white trust funders who say, I'm an artist, make no money off of it, and live off their parents' dime, moved into Brooklyn and gentrified it. And now they're moving into Detroit and supposedly gentrifying it. You're not speaking of artists. You're talking about trust funders. I'm with you. I hate inherited wealth, and that's a bias of mine. I'm not saying it's a good facet of my personality that I genuinely dislike people who inherit wealth. I don't like those people, and that's a problem of mine. They weren't born that way. I mean, they didn't choose to be the spawn of wealthy people. I would feel like a piece of shit if somebody disliked me because my family was wealthy. Fortunately, my family's not wealthy, so if I have any success, it had little to nothing to do with their finances. But the fact is, this is a socio-economic issue. It's not a racial issue. As you get further into talking about white people as parasites, which I found just appalling.
The title of this New York Times article by this guy Elms was like, I moved to Detroit from Brooklyn because Brooklyn totally lost its sense of adventure. It became sanitized, it became gentrified, and I was done with it. And now, I'm going to start over fresh in Detroit. And he goes on to explain, how, as I'm sure we all know, everything in Detroit is super cheap. The land is super cheap right now. The houses are super cheap right now. This guy goes on to explain how he bought 9 buildings to utilize for art space that cost less than his one apartment in New York. And then they have tons of other stories from other people that are doing, white people, artists especially, and small business owners that are doing the same thing.
Yeah, artists don't buy up 9 properties. Those are called venture capitalists. They're called opportunists, all right? Opportunists and venture capitalists. That's something totally different. Again, this is a socio-economic issue. It's not a racial issue. So lumping people into white versus black is divisive, it's counterproductive, and it's deeply ignorant and faulted in its logic.
What these white creatives and these white hipsters and these well-to-do white people see is they see a blank canvas. They completely, disavow the people that are there, and that is the backbone of gentrification. And gentrification is basically modern day colonization. It is modern day colonization. You're not allowed to go into an inhabited country anymore and fucking kill all the people there and kick their asses out.
Wait, colonialism, people can't inhabit other countries anymore? Why don't you just send a memo to Tibet? Remind them, hey, why don't you call China? This doesn't go on anymore. That's just one example. That goes on all the time.
I've been telling my husband, Detroit is going to come back. Detroit is going to come back. I was like, especially with these property values so low, I was like, white people are going to move out there. They're going to buy everything up. They're going to gentrify the fuck out of that city, and Detroit is going to come back. And that is really exactly what's happening now, because that is how white people work, okay? Colonialism, gentrification, it's parasitism. White people are parasites. I'm going to read you guys the definition of parasites. Parasitism. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Parasitism, whatever. It is a non-mutual, that is key, non-mutual, symbiotic relationship between species where one species, the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other, the host. You know what else that kind of sounds like? Slavery. When a whole group of people benefited off of another entire group of people. When a whole group of white people sat on their asses and didn't do shit, but benefit off of an entire other group of people doing all their fucking work for them. White people are parasites.
Oh, where a bunch of white people owned black people and made them work for those lazy white people. Well, if you had done a marginal amount of homework, you would find that to be quite contrary. As a matter of fact, slavery existed for over a millennia in Africa before the European slave trade. Black Africans owned other black Africans. That was going on for a millennia, much longer than colonial slavery in the United States. And of the 13 million slaves imported from Africa, only 400,000 came to the United States. The rest went to South America and Brazil, who seem conspicuously absent in this argument. They're not white. Suddenly, somehow, white people are always accused of slave owners and the people who perpetuated slaves, while in fact, slavery existed long before white people got their hand into it. In fact, they were late to come to that party, and white people were the first Western culture to abolish slavery. When the Union, mostly white army, but include blacks as well, fought against the Confederacy to abolish slavery, the Confederacy was funded by black people who owned slaves. Black slave owners fought in favor of slavery and murdered white people to free who were trying to free black people. Slavery as an institution only became legal due to a black slave owner. Actually, they set the precedent. Anthony Johnson had an elderly slave run away from his plantation. Anthony Johnson was a free black man who owned a large plantation and owned many slaves. One happened to be John Casor. John Casor was an ailing old man who ran away to the neighbor, a white guy by the name of Robert Parker. Now Robert Parker held John Casor for clemency, to relieve this elderly man of his slave duties. And Anthony Johnson, the black African-American slave owner, went to the courts and said, "That's my slave, I own him." And he won, setting a legal precedent for slave ownership. As in, the first slave owner legally was a black man, not a white man. The legal precedent of slavery was established by a black man to just burden an ailing, aged other black man who was a slave, who apparently was owned by this man, and he worked that man to death. That's what happened. That's what started slavery in the colonies. Now, I want to make sure you recall the beginning of the video where I say we should not attribute the actions of single people to the rest of their race or gender. So the fact that the first slave owner was a black man is not a testament against black people as horrible people or slave owners. But the fact of the matter is, black people, plenty of them, thousands of black people, were plantation owners who owned thousands and thousands of black slaves and supported the Confederate Army to continue slavery during the Civil War. Okay, so you're saying white people are coming into Brooklyn, and I'm going to refute that in a second anyway. You're saying white people are coming into Brooklyn and Detroit because white artists, because they value the rich culture of the black community that is established there. So the rich black cultural tapestry created by the black community is something to be valued by future trendsetters, and that's held within black communities. They create that. Black communities synthesize that out of nothing, out of their own artistry and humanitarianism. You know what I would consider that? I would consider that black privilege. Yes, black privilege. That exists. Apparently. Maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, white privilege doesn't exist. I have not lived within white privilege. White people, rich white people, I don't govern things. I don't make political decisions. I don't make large financial decisions. I don't govern people. I don't manage people. I have no white perks. There's no white privilege I live under. In fact, I would have been much better off being Native American because I applied to Cornell and Columbia, two Ivy League schools, when I had a 4.0 GPA, as in a GPA that cannot go higher. A perfect GPA when I applied to Cornell and Columbia, and I got denied. Whereas if I was Native American, I would have gotten into those schools and I'd be a doctor today. There's no disputing that. In fact, my recruiter said that point blank. Well, if you want to get, the only way to certainly get into a school that's discriminatory is to have perfect grades and be Native American. And I said, well, I have perfect grades. And they're like, well, you're half there. Yeah, white privilege didn't really work in my favor. My entire life would be different if I was a minority. It would have worked in my favor. Because I work hard at what I do, but it doesn't pay off. It's the same thing with the comedian Aziz Ansari. Yeah, he's funny, but, you know, if he was a white comedian, nobody would know who the fuck he is. Affirmative action is minority privilege. It's black privilege. I don't get to take advantage of that. Abortion is female privilege. I have no say whether or not we get to keep the kid that I helped create. That's female privilege. White male privilege is just a term that minorities use to silence white people. And it's a crock of shit, and it's fucking irritating. And what pisses me off the most is that I can't even say this honestly onto a YouTube video without getting slandered for being a bigot. I'm just being honest. I'm accepting reality at this point. Yeah, I should have gotten into school. 4.0, can't do any better than that. What else do I have to do? No, it would be great if my parents were donated to the school. Yeah, I wish I had wealth. I wish I had minority status. I wish I got to choose whether or not to keep the children that I create. Being white's not fucking great. And stop being bigoted against white people. Yeah, and we're not parasites. We'll get into that.
They're parasites. Colonialism is a form of parasitism. Excuse me if I am mispronouncing that. And gentrification is also another form of colonialism, of parasitism, of violence. This is violence. White people enact violence against the people that are native to an area. They come in, they kick everyone out, they raise the property value, they push everyone out, and then they basically consume everything and then they move on. They are parasites. Look at this story with this man talking about Brooklyn versus Detroit. He is waxing poetic about, you know, the adventures of Detroit and the grittiness, and it's so raw and real. You know how white people are with that type of shit. And talking about how Brooklyn has become, you know, hyper gentrified and hyper sanitized and just doesn't have that same old feeling. And there is absolutely no awareness of the fact that people like you, this man, this white man, are what caused that gentrification in Brooklyn. There is absolutely no awareness of that fact. And now you're gonna, you know, you've consumed everything in Brooklyn. You've consumed the culture. You've consumed the resources. You've driven everyone away that made Brooklyn what it was, and you turned it into some white, sanitized bullshit like I'll do with everything. Now that you've wrung every last drop out of the borough, you don't want it anymore, and you're gonna move on, and you're gonna do the same exact thing somewhere else.
Slavery still goes on around the world, including in Africa. There are still black slaves that exist today in 2017. So I don't know why we're bitching about our ancestors, especially when statistically the amount of, when you say white people enslaved black people, that's mostly not true. Of the free whites in 1860, right before the emancipation, 1.4% of white people owned slaves. 1.4%. Of the free blacks in 1860, 28% owned slaves. That means in 1860, if you were walking down the street and you ran into a black man and a white man speaking to each other, the black man was 20 times more likely to own a slave than the white man. Statistically, more black people own slaves than white people. Not demographically, there were more white people in the population. So, by sheer numbers, more white people had plantations with slaves in it. But 28% of free black men own slaves, whereas 1.4%. So when you say white people enslave black people, 98.6% of white people did not enslave anybody, whereas 72% of black people didn't enslave other black people. So it's a little misleading. So basically what I'm not saying that's the fault of white people or black people. It's inhumanitarian. I think it's universally deemed as an incorrigible act that is universally disrespected and nobody agrees with anymore whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is that you can't attribute this to a body of people based on race or gender. Also, long before the transatlantic slave trade, the Moors, who were a black culture, the Moors bought white slaves from Carthage for 500 years. That's longer than colonial slavery. So black people enslaved white people for longer than white people enslaved black people during colonial times, and we just dispelled the notion of white people enslaving black people. Now let's get to what you consider the gentrification of Brooklyn. And by gentrification, you illuminate a number of times that it's white artistry type of people moving into Brooklyn, that the whites have taken over Brooklyn, and you're calling that gentrification. Well, I got statistics as to the demographics of Brooklyn, which you said has become too gentrified. In 1900, we'll start in 1900, the white population in Brooklyn was 1.14 million. The black population was 18,000. The black population in Brooklyn in 1900 was 1%. If you cut to 1980, I'm going to skip a few, it went from 1% to 36.6% black. And then if you cut to present day, it's almost 50% black. So your argument that Brooklyn became white and that these pseudo-white artists adopted black culture is just completely false. There is no grounds whatsoever to say that. It was quite the opposite. Whether or not gentrification definitely happened in high order because of building and reconstruction that was going on. But in terms of race, it over the century and specifically over the last 30 years since I've been alive, black people have moved in and created, black people actually outnumber white people in Brooklyn. Whereas in 1900, 99% of the people in Brooklyn were white, mostly Irish and Italian descent, and a few Polish, and 1% was black. So your notion that Brooklyn turned white all of a sudden is completely unfounded, egregiously false, arrogant, racist, and I think you're a fucking bitch for saying shit like that. You have no foundation for saying that, you know? As for gentrification in New York City as a whole, which you were talking about, I would like to refer you to the relatively recent past. Mayor Koch, Koch, those of you who are over 30 probably know the name, was elected mayor of New York City in 1978. used an astounding several billion dollars in taxes to rehabilitate 200,000 residencies to be remodeled specifically for affordable lower income New Yorkers. Mayor Koch, a white guy, 200,000 residencies for lower income families, meaning at the time minorities. So he was gentrifying it and making it affordable for minorities. He lost the following election after his big public works project to David Dinkins, the first and still today only black mayor of New York City, who promptly stopped construction of affordable housing for black people, increased the police presence and budget by 25%. So money going to house minority people in New York City got cut, and he hired more police by 25% and incarcerated more black people than had been precedented beforehand. And then this only black mayor of New York City, his other big contribution was to the game of tennis, that faggot white country club sport. So, and if you're offended by faggot, I don't mean it in terms of sexuality, I mean it in terms of annoyance. So, yeah. Koch was for lower income gentrification and affordable housing for minorities, 200,000 housing units. The black mayor David Dinkins was for police enforcement and black incarceration. So I don't know why you continue to call white people parasites. It's not a racial issue. It's an individual issue. We're all individuals. And as an individual, I think you're fucking racist. I think you're a horrible person. And I think you're perpetuating racism when you really should be fighting for merit-based work. You should be encouraging people to... I don't give a fuck if people unite between races or not. All I care about is public contributions to humanity. People who contribute to humanity. We don't have to unite like some sort of rainbow of colors across a spectrum. Racism is going to exist whether or not. The fact is you should ignore it, not perpetuate it, not perpetuate hate speech, and contribute something to culture. It's not white people who are a parasite. It's not black people who are a parasite. And as a matter of fact, there's enormous amounts of slavery going on in China and other non-Western cultures right now that we could be doing something about, but we're not. The fact is you're still bitching about how white people are parasites and they're buying shit. You know, if Detroit is selling property so cheaply, why don't you just buy property and gentrify it yourself? Why does it need to be white people, and why do you need to call them opportunists? If you notice the opportunity, why aren't you taking advantage of it? I'm not, because I'm broke. I'm a white broke person. I'm not privileged. Surprise! It sucks to be me. I'm not buying property. But the fact is, if you notice an opportunity and somebody else does and they get there first, that's just capitalism. And you live in capitalism, and you live in a first world Western culture that treats you pretty well, that gives you the freedom to speak about these things with hate-filled rhetoric that's totally misleading and false and statistically inaccurate. So I think everything you stand for is a crock of shit. And I think you're a parasite. And I've never said that about another human being. And actually, all the hate-filled fucking comments that this video has garnered is really appalling. Why can't we just have civil discussions about this instead of people being like, white people ruin everything? It's a socioeconomic issue. It's not the white who destroyed the black. It's the authoritarian class that is destroying the proletariat. The people are sucked up by the people who are in authority, who continue to confer authority and bequeath it onto people within the same family. And we should be working against them. We should be working together for the people. Because I don't know shit about you in the video, but I bet you we have similar lives. Aside from the fact that you're female and I'm a male, I'm guessing you're as broke as I am, and I'm guessing you're as broke as I am, and I'm guessing you're equally as opinionated. And I'm guessing fuck you, and that's what you want to say to me, but too bad. Why don't we work together on this? That's basically what I want to say. And your beliefs on slavery, it's not a white issue. It has nothing to do with that. The legal precedent for slavery was established by a black man. White people aren't parasites. I like black people just as much as I like white people, which is not very much. I am not a people person. But the fact is, I'm willing to work with other people and talk to other people and expound and try to move things forward. Yeah, and I take people on an individual basis. I don't lump them into masses. I think your video is appalling. I think the commentary under your video is appalling. And I think you're sorely mistaken. And I think you're going to be a victim the rest of your life if you don't change your attitude. And so will the people commenting below the video. You know, I didn't want to do this shameless self-promotion, but it's the only way people actually fucking subscribe. So subscribe. Alright, thanks for watching.